happened on a bitterly cold night in 2011. K-9 officer David was on duty in a quiet, still suburb of Ohio, along with his 4-year-old, fully trained German Shepherd, Rex. David had almost 9 years of experience on the police force, and Rex was one of the department's best tracking and narcotics detection dogs, staying calm in any tense situation and following commands without hesitation. That was simply Rex's nature. But what happened that night wasn't an ordinary shift for either of them. After a report of a break-in and a struggle, a suspect had fled on foot into the neighborhood. Once the call came in, David and Rex were sent to search a 2-story American suburban house. The wooden gate beside the house was standing half open, and the back door was unlocked too. Neighbors told police that just a little while earlier, they'd heard the sharp sounds of a struggle coming from the backyard, with other officers covering the ground floor and the outside of the house. David took Rex and quickly swept the first-floor rooms, confirming no one was there. Then, the two of them carefully made their way up the wooden staircase to the second floor. Aside from the heavy thud of David's boots on the steps and the soft click of Rex's paws, the whole house was dead silent. At the top of the stairs, they stepped into a narrow, dark hallway. 3 bedrooms and a bathroom lined either side of that hallway. Just as they reached the bathroom door, Rex suddenly went completely still. His ears snapped up, and his whole body tensed in an instant. Normally, a trained K-9 lunges forward the moment it senses a suspect nearby, but Rex's behavior was the exact opposite. He first looked toward the dark bathroom doorway, then slowly turned his head to stare down the far end of the hallway. From deep in his throat came a growl, something both terrified and vicious at once, a sound David had rarely heard in his entire career. David swung his flashlight beam straight down to the far end of the hallway. Standing right outside the last door was a tall, human-shaped figure. The figure was extremely tall, pitch black, and completely motionless, even under the flashlight's beam. No details of its clothing or face came into focus. Like a thick layer of pure darkness was simply standing there. David immediately snapped into alert mode and shouted, "Police! Hands up! Come out!" But the figure gave no answer, didn't move even slightly. To his shock, David noticed Rex yanking hard on the leash, as if he was trying with everything he had to pull David away from that spot. This dog, seasoned by countless operations, absolutely refused to move any further down that hallway, as if a wave of raw, invisible dread was pouring off of that figure ahead. In the next instant, the dark figure turned and, in complete silence, walked slowly into the last bedroom. The door had been open. David never took the flashlight beam off the figure, not for a single moment. Right in front of his eyes, the figure walked into the room and vanished from sight. David figured the fleeing suspect must be hiding in that room. He quickly radioed the other officers, calling for backup on the second floor. Weapon raised, David started moving toward the room, but Rex seemed to be fighting with everything he had to hold him back. His whole body was shaking with fear, and he would not cross that last doorway's threshold, no matter what. Forced to act, David loosened Rex's leash a bit and left him standing just outside the door. Then, he stepped inside alone, carefully, sweeping the flashlight beam around the room. But what he saw made his chest go ice cold in an instant. The room was completely empty. There was no one there, anywhere. The closed windows were locked tight from the inside. The closet was empty, and no one was hiding under the bed or behind the curtains. There was no hidden door or second way out of the room either. And the strangest part of all, the The figure had walked into that room right in front of David's eyes. He hadn't taken his eyes off it for even a second while standing outside the door. And yet, once he stepped inside, there wasn't a single trace of it anywhere. A little while later, the other officers arrived and they searched the whole house again, the roof, the bathroom, everything. But there was no sign anywhere of that tall, shadowy figure. After nearly 20 minutes of searching every room, the roof, and the surrounding area with nothing turning up, David was finally forced to take Rex and leave the house. Once they got outside into the open air, Rex slowly calmed back down, but he kept turning to stare back up at the window of that last room on the second floor, again and again. To this day, David is certain that the figure standing at the end of that hallway wasn't some trick of the mind, but how a flesh and blood person could vanish into thin air from inside a locked room, that question has never been answered. And Rex, who had never once backed down in his entire career, exactly what he saw that night that made him refuse to set foot across that threshold, that mystery remains unsolved to this day. It was a stormy night back in 2012. Heavy rain was pouring down on a small, quiet town in Oregon. Frequent lightning strikes had knocked out power across the whole area. Late that night, a young police officer named Lucas and his partner Chris were on duty. It was around 2 in the morning. They were sitting in their patrol car, watching the darkness around them, when an urgent message came through on the radio from dispatcher Claire. Claire told them a very strange call had come in to 911. An adult man on the other end of the line was claiming he was trapped inside a house and had been kidnapped. But there was deep concern in Claire's voice. The man's voice had sounded so unnatural that at first she thought he might be using some kind of voice-changing device. She could hardly believe that a grown man's voice could shift and sound like a little girl's. The call had lasted only a short time, but the 911 system had managed to pinpoint a specific address based on the location data. Since the situation seemed so unusual, Lucas and Chris headed straight for that address. When they reached the edge of town, they found a rundown, nearly abandoned house. The bushes and grass around the house had grown so wild that it looked like no one had properly looked after the place in a very long time. They knocked on the front door, and for a moment, silence hung in the air. Then a dim light flickered on inside. A little while later, the owner of the house cracked the door open just enough to poke his face out. There was a kind of cold detachment about the man, who looked middle-aged. He claimed the 911 call must have been made by mistake and that he lived completely alone in the house. But there was an intense uneasiness in his eyes and on his face. In truth, right at the moment the police had knocked on the door, he'd remembered that his phone had fallen down in the basement while he was bringing food down there. The police showed up at the door before he had a chance to go get it, so he never got the opportunity to head back downstairs. His behavior grew even more unusual once the police told him that the 911 call's location matched this exact house, given that there was enough reason to believe someone might be in danger, and suspecting that someone inside the house might need help. Lucas and Chris decided to enter the house under the emergency circumstances. The inside of the house was filthy and damp. But the most shocking thing was that the living room and hallway were scattered with all kinds of little kids' toys, a few pairs of diapers, and women's clothing. When Lucas asked who all this belonged to, the man hesitated slightly and said he had no children, and that the toys were supposedly being kept for his nieces. But the hesitation on his face made it painfully clear he was hiding something. As the officers moved further into the house, they spotted a life-size doll sitting in the corner of one room. The doll had been dressed in women's clothing. An old chair had been placed on the floor in front of the strangely arranged doll. The sight left Lucas with a deep, sinking sense of unease. Right before heading down to the basement, Lucas's eyes lingered on the doll for one more moment. By this point, the homeowner was visibly nervous and tried to stop them from heading toward the basement. Ignoring his attempt to stop them, Lucas and Chris switched on their flashlights and started down the narrow staircase. The air in the basement was thick and stuffy, filled with the damp smell of mold. A few steps down into the darkness, they heard a faint knocking sound coming from behind a closed door inside, along with a very weak, low moaning sound. They still had no idea that something had happened inside that very room just a few minutes earlier, something that was the entire reason the strange 911 call had even been possible. Sensing they were now certain of danger, both officers immediately raised their weapons. Lucas stood in front of the door and called out in a firm voice, warning whoever was inside and telling them to step back from the door. No answer came. After waiting a few seconds, Lucas reached out and slid open the latch on the outside of the door. Then, slowly pushing the door open, the beam of his flashlight fell into the room. In one corner of the damp floor lay an old blanket, a container of water, an old bucket, and a few empty food packets. And standing right beside them was a gaunt, emaciated, middle-aged man, so weak that he had to lean against the wooden wall just to stay standing. For a few moments, Lucas and Chris couldn't say a single word. The moment the man said his own name, it brought back to Lucas's mind a missing person case from 2 years earlier. The man was a father of 3, someone his family and the investigators had long since assumed was dead. After he went missing, no trace of his car, his phone, or any reliable last known location had ever turned up. One by one, the leads in the investigation had slowly gone cold, so no one could ever have imagined that he had been alive this whole time, held captive in that very house's basement. The follow-up investigation uncovered a chilling picture of psychological torment. The homeowner had kept the man locked in that basement for 2 years. The diapers, the little kids' toys, and the women's clothing found in the living room were directly tied to the abuse carried out against him. He had been forced to wear clothing that had been specifically chosen to humiliate his own identity. After that, he'd been made to sit for hours at a time in the chair in front of that doll, forced to act and talk like a small child. 2 long years of fear, isolation, and this twisted psychological abuse had changed his ordinary behavior and manner of speaking so drastically that when he called 911, his voice hadn't come out sounding like a grown man's at all. To Claire, on the other end of the line, it had sounded like the voice of a helpless little girl. There was no digital filter behind it. Years of unbearable psychological strain, the loss of his ordinary way of speaking, and being forced to talk like a child had changed the natural weight, pronunciation, and rhythm of his voice so completely that Claire genuinely could not tell he was an adult man. The follow-up investigation also revealed that just minutes before the 911 call, the homeowner had brought him food and then locked the room back up from outside. On his way out, he carelessly left his own phone behind in the room. A little while later, a notification came through on the phone, lighting up the screen in the dark room. In that faint glow, the captive man spotted the unlocked phone lying on the floor. He had no way of knowing if he'd ever get a second chance like this. So, with trembling hands, he picked up the phone and dialed 911. That call, lasting only a few moments, was what finally brought his 2 years of captivity to an end. The homeowner was arrested, and after receiving medical treatment at the hospital, the victim was returned to his family. But was he really ever free from that nightmare? Even after he went home to his family from the hospital, investigators noticed that he never wanted to talk about certain things that had happened in that basement. What exactly happened behind that locked door? Maybe something. Even he can never fully bring himself to tell another living soul. And the most terrifying question of all still remains unanswered to this day. What other unimaginable psychological horrors did he endure behind that locked door during those 2 long years of darkness? The kind of things he may never be able to tell another soul as long as he lives. It was a cold October night in 2014. A deep silence hung over a quiet, still residential neighborhood in Ohio. The time was close to 2:30 in the morning. Officer Mark, about 8 years into his career, was on night shift duty. Then an urgent call came through on his patrol car radio. A woman had called 911 to report that she heard a desperate scream from a woman coming from her neighbor's house. Around the same time, a 911 call had come in from the landline inside that very house, but the operator lost the call within a few seconds. Later, all that could be heard on the recording was a woman's panicked breathing and the faint sound of something metal falling in the distance. When Mark arrived at the location given by the emergency call, a light drizzle was falling outside. Everything around him was completely dark. Standing in front of the house, he noticed that the front door was slightly open. No lights were on inside. Mark immediately radioed in the situation and requested backup. He was told no unit was nearby, so help would take a few minutes to arrive. Worried that someone inside might be badly hurt, Mark pulled out his flashlight, announced himself as police, and carefully stepped inside. There were no signs of a struggle on the first floor or in the kitchen, but on the kitchen counter sat a glass, half full of water. A few drops of water lay beside the glass, as if someone had been standing right there just minutes before. Mark looked around carefully and radioed in his position again. The house was so silent, but he could clearly hear the sound of his own breathing. Finding no one downstairs, Mark carefully decided to head up to the second floor. As he climbed the stairs, he heard a faint scraping sound coming from the room above. He froze instantly and waited a few seconds, but no other sound followed. He stepped into the bedroom and found no one there. All he saw was a messy, unmade bed and a table lamp knocked over on the floor. Then, as he moved toward the bathroom door, his eyes landed on the carpet outside it. There was a clear, wet, dark stain there. In the beam of his flashlight, Mark had no doubt it was fresh blood. Inside the bathroom, more blood stains marked the tiles and the edge of the bathtub. Mark crouched down to examine the stains and realized the blood hadn't fully dried yet. Right at that moment, a very faint sound reached him from downstairs, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Putting together the bloodstains and that dragging sound, it occurred to Mark that maybe someone injured had been carried down from the upper floor. Mark hurried back down the stairs. A closed door in the narrow hallway on the first floor caught his eye, one he had first taken for a coat closet or a pantry. Cold, damp air was seeping out from under the door. When Mark opened it, he found a narrow, steep staircase behind it, leading straight down into darkness. It was the way down to the basement. He radioed in his position and slowly began making his way down, sweeping his flashlight ahead of him. Backup was still a few minutes out. The air in the basement was heavy, damp, and thick with the coppery smell of blood. As he stepped off the last stair, Mark spotted several wet shoe prints on the floor, leading further into the basement. When he reached the bottom and shone his light around, he flinched. In the middle of the basement stood an old metal chair. Cut plastic zip ties hung from both armrests, and directly beneath the chair, a large pool of blood had congealed. The blood had spread all the way to the legs of the chair. It was clear that someone had been tied up tightly right there not long before. Right at that moment, a very faint sound came from a dark corner far across the basement. Mark slowly turned his flashlight toward it. Behind some old wooden boxes, something seemed to shift. Then a very faint breathing sound reached his ears. Mark immediately drew his gun and ordered the person to stand still. A dark, shadowy figure slowly rose up from behind the boxes. Mark ordered him to stop again, but the man ignored the order and suddenly bolted with impossible speed toward a small window at the far end of the basement. Because the ground behind the house sloped slightly downward, the window sat at roughly waist height from outside. In one motion, the man smashed through the glass and dove through the window frame, out into the night. Wearing a heavy-duty belt and full gear, there was no way Mark could get through that small window quickly. So he immediately turned and rushed out through the basement's back exit door instead. Within seconds, he was outside and saw the man running down the narrow alley behind the house. Mark chased after him, shouting for him to stop again and again. But between the darkness of the night, the rain-slicked street, and the turns in the alley, the distance between them grew fast. The man rounded one corner and vanished in an instant. Within a short time, additional police units, a K-9 squad, and investigating detectives arrived at the scene. But even after combing the entire area, they found no trace of the unidentified man. The investigation that followed revealed that the house belonged to a middle-aged man named Devin, who lived there alone. Devin was never found after that night. His wallet, phone, and car keys were all still sitting inside the house, untouched. Blood testing confirmed that the blood found in the basement was Devin's. But despite the massive amount of blood loss, no body was ever found, and there was no confirmed proof of Devin's death. The most puzzling detail of all was that the desperate scream the neighbor heard had come from a woman's voice. The 911 call, recorded from the house's landline, had also captured the sound of a woman's panicked breathing. And yet, nothing in Devin's personal life, his relationships, or anyone connected to the house showed any evidence of a woman having any connection to him at all. The identity of the unknown person who had been in the basement that night was also never discovered. Many years have passed since that night. A new family lives in the house now. Officer Mark has since retired from the force. Still, he can't forget that unresolved night. The blood stains in the basement, the cut zip tie left on the chair, and the shadowy figure that vanished into the rain-soaked alley within seconds still haunt him to this day. The most unsettling question of all still lingers in his mind. Who was that woman who really called 911 from Devin's landmine that night? And where did she disappear to?